I grew up in a small coal town in the Appalachians. Our house was on the side of a mountain with a view of the town, perfect for a kid who loved the outdoors. We didn't have any close neighbors, but there were plenty of woods to explore. Above our house, a ridge marked the boundary of a state park, though the public trails were far down in the valley, separated by dense forest and many "do not enter" signs. Because of this, hikers rarely came to our property. A dirt road from our house led up the mountain to the remains of a burned-down cabin. From there, you could reach a clearing with large, flat rocks and a power tower. This spot was a favorite of mine, a place where I'd often take our black dog, Felicia, to read and explore. When I was 13, I went up there with Felicia on an early fall day. I knew to stay away from the trail camera my dad's friend had put up for tracking wildlife, as I'd already gotten in trouble for using up rolls of film by accident. Settling on my favorite rock by the power lines, I started reading when Felicia suddenly began barking and growling. She usually chased after deer, but this time she stayed close to me, growling at something in the dense bushes on the steep hillside below the ridge. A man emerged from the brush, pushing through the dense undergrowth. Nervous, I called out, hello?" while holding Felicia's collar to keep her from jumping on him. He pulled himself out of the bushes, climbing up to the base of my rock. Something about him put me off, but I couldn't say what it was. He looked normal enough, mid to late 20s, average build, dressed like a hiker and not carrying any supplies. "Hey there," he greeted me without a local accent. Most people here have a strong regional drawl, and we didn't get many visitors. "I'm from down the hill," I said, explaining I was out hiking with my dog. He smiled but made no effort to stop Felicia from barking and growling. She looked like she was ready to attack him. "She needs to be on a leash. You wouldn't want to upset the park," he commented. "We leash her when we're in the park," I said, explaining that this part was our property, though he seemed unfazed by the idea he was trespassing. "I'm from the park," he said, smiling in a way that made me uneasy. "I'm here to check on the land. What would you have done if she jumped on me?" My stomach dropped. I knew he was lying. We only had one park ranger, and I'd known him all my life. Getting out the leash, I clipped it to Felicia and said, "Sorry, we'll let you get on with your hike. I should head home." "Does your family know you're up here?" he asked. "Yes, they're waiting for me soon. My dad comes up here often to check the trail cameras." His smile faltered for the first time when I mentioned the trail cameras. "Trail cameras?" he asked. "Yeah," I replied, hoping he'd take the hint. "There are a lot of them up here. My dad and his friends hunt here, and they like to keep an eye on the deer." The smile came back, but this time it was colder, lacking the friendliness he'd shown before. "Sounds like a great setup for hunting," he said. Then, with a strange look, he took a step toward me. Felicia lunged, nearly yanking the leash from my hands, but I managed to hold her back. "Keep a tight grip on that leash," he said, still smiling that unsettling smile. "Maybe I'll see you up here again someday." "Maybe," I muttered, though I knew I'd never willingly return to that spot if I could help it. As I walked away, I could feel his gaze on my back. Every so often I glanced over my shoulder, and each time, he was standing in the same spot, just watching me with that eerie smile. As soon as he was out of sight, I picked up my pace, practically dragging Felicia with me. She kept looking back and growling, clearly just as disturbed by him as I was. Every now and then, I heard twigs snapping behind me, but when I turned around, no one was there. Eventually, I came to a clearing where the trail camera was set up, and I bolted toward it. I didn't care about taking the trail anymore. I wanted to get home as fast as possible. When I reached the road that led back to our house, I let Felicia off the leash, and we ran the rest of the way home. At first, I didn't tell my parents about the man. They already worried about me exploring the woods alone, and I didn't want them forbidding me from going back. But later that week, when my dad's friend came by to collect the trail camera film, my dad called me over, furious. He accused me of messing with the camera because the film had only a few shots on it, and the camera had been switched off after the first few frames. I denied it at first, but then I remembered the strange man. I told my dad what had happened, but he didn't believe me at first. To him, it seemed like a made-up story to cover my tracks. Still, he called the park ranger to check if there was anyone new in the area. The ranger said no, but after hearing my story, he mentioned that a park employee had recently encountered a young man camping illegally near the campgrounds. The ranger described him as quiet, friendly, and unremarkable, but said the incident had stood out because the man was from out of state. A few days later, my dad's friend called with an update. Although there were only a few shots on the film, he had developed it. In the last shot, you could see me and Felicia walking across the clearing. Just behind us in the shadows was the figure of a man watching us. He must have thought there were more cameras and decided not to follow us any further. I was glad I'd mentioned multiple cameras. My parents put up new fencing to close off our access to that area, and to this day I still feel uneasy thinking about it. That was the last time I ever went near that spot on the ridge. Five years ago, when I was 26, I was drowning in debt and stuck in a small Washington town with no job prospects. My friend suggested I try woofing, volunteering on organic farms, as a way to travel affordably. You work about 25 hours a week in exchange for food and board. I traveled around doing cash jobs on the side to save money. After several months, I had enough to travel internationally, so I let a randomizer pick a destination. It chose Georgia, a place I knew little about, but I liked the idea of a true adventure. I arranged to stay at a farm in a remote area, on a mountain, with a family that had sent me friendly photos of a cozy stone house and a happy, bustling farm. When I arrived, it was a challenging trip involving Soviet-era buses and rough roads. The house was isolated, surrounded by brown, desolate hills. A middle-aged man named Geary, not his real name, greeted me, and though he was friendly, something felt off. The farm was in poor shape: dead trees, a collapsed barn, and a house that reeked of mold. There was no sign of the family from the photos. Geary said his family was away for a bit. Though uneasy, I was exhausted, so I had dinner with him and went to sleep. I awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of something heavy being dragged across the wooden floor. The sound eventually stopped, and I managed to fall back asleep, attributing it to an animal or maybe even my imagination. The next day, Geary left to get supplies, leaving me alone. I explored the house and noticed none of the photos matched the state of the farm or the man himself. With Geary gone, I took the opportunity to look around. The place had the feel of an abandoned house, with broken furniture, scattered old newspapers, cracked mirrors, and dust everywhere. Something definitely felt wrong. I pulled out my phone to double-check the listing photos, realizing with a shiver that the yard, garden, and even the walls in the pictures looked nothing like this place. And more disturbing, there was no sign of Geary in any of them. I felt a deep, crawling dread. I knew I had to leave, so I began gathering my things as quietly as I could. Just as I was zipping up my bag, I saw 3 men walking up the steep path to the house. I looked around frantically, realizing there was no way out but to run. As the men approached, I decided to slip out the back and climb down the hill, scrambling into the dense brush. I crouched low and tried not to make a sound as I heard the men enter the house, their voices carrying as they searched. I stayed hidden for what felt like hours, my heart pounding every time I heard footsteps nearby. Eventually, I heard the men leave, but I waited even longer to make sure they were really gone. When I was finally convinced the coast was clear, I slipped back to the main road and started walking down the mountain. Hours later, exhausted and scared, I managed to flag down a passing car, a family who thankfully drove me all the way to town. A few days after I left, I checked the farm's page on the woofing site, only to find that it had been taken down. I haven't heard from Geary or anyone else associated with that place since. Some friends later joked that maybe he was harmless and just wanted some company, but I trust my gut. There was something truly wrong with that place, and I'm glad I left when I did. When I was 13, about 5 years ago, I started sneaking out of my window at night to wander around. It was quiet and peaceful, and I loved the stillness of the night. I'd be out from midnight to 3 or 4 in the morning, wandering fields and nearby paths. One night I found a small forest on the outskirts of town. I was curious, but it was too dark to enter. I went back the next night with a flashlight and even marked my way with sticks to find my way back. I only saw a hedgehog that night, but I returned again and again because it was the most peaceful place I'd ever found. On the 4th night, it started raining lightly, so I decided to go deeper into the forest. Confident, I didn't leave any markers behind. After about 10 minutes, I noticed a light coming from far off in the trees. I put away my flashlight and waited, but the light disappeared, so I resumed walking. After another 25 minutes, I saw the light again, much closer this time. I climbed a tree and waited. The light belonged to a man carrying a different flashlight. He wasn't coming directly toward me, but was moving in my direction, glancing over his shoulder as though he were being followed. He looked rough. His shirt was torn, and he wore only boxers. He stopped at the base of a tree about 15 feet from me, sitting down and breathing heavily. Then he pulled out a bag, opened it, and started going through it. After a few moments, his phone rang. He answered but said nothing, just breathing into the receiver. Suddenly, he threw the phone into the bushes and bolted, leaving his bag behind. I waited until he was out of sight, then climbed down and checked out the bag. There was a wallet and an expensive camera inside. Just as I was about to reach for the wallet, I saw another light in the distance, this one from a different flashlight. I quickly climbed back up the tree and watched as the second person reached the phone, which had begun ringing again. After answering, they searched the area but didn't approach the bag. When I could no longer see the light, I climbed down and ran home shaken. I didn't get much sleep after that. The next day, I took a bus to the police station and told them what had happened. But by the time they went back with me to the forest, the bag was gone. They found the spot where the phone had been tossed but found nothing else. I watched the news for weeks, hoping for answers, but there was never any mention of it. After that, I never went out alone at night again. Growing up, I lived in a rural area with my aunt, uncle, and older brothers. Our home was isolated, surrounded only by a vast field with an old empty house we owned but rarely used. My uncle loved telling us stories about our land and the people who had lived there before us, especially about the old cabin out in the field. One story he told me was so eerie that it has stuck with me ever since. According to him, a farmer and his young daughter used to live in that cabin. They were the only people around, and the farmer worked tirelessly to keep up the land. His daughter, a sweet, lively 6-year-old with long, dark hair, would often play outside while he worked. Tragically, one day while harvesting crops, he didn't see her playing nearby until it was too late. She was caught in the machinery, and the accident took her life. My uncle described it as one of the saddest events in the area's history. My brother Robert, usually fearless, decided to camp out with friends in that old cabin one weekend. They wanted to clean it up and maybe even use it as a hangout spot. I hadn't told him my uncle's story, so he and his friends went into the night unaware of any dark history surrounding the place. They set up camp, cooked dinner, and enjoyed the evening, laughing and telling stories. Late into the night, when everyone else was asleep, Robert woke to the sound of soft crying. At first he thought he was imagining it, but as the seconds passed, he realized the sound was real and coming from just outside. His heart started racing, but he tried to dismiss it, thinking maybe it was a trick of the wind or an animal far off in the field. But the crying continued, growing louder, and was joined by faint screams that seemed to be coming from right outside the cabin. Terrified, Robert looked toward the foot of his bed and froze. A young girl sat there, her face obscured and her body covered in cuts. She was just sitting there, crying as if in terrible pain, with long, dark hair falling over her face. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, just stared as she kept crying. Robert and his friends burst into the house minutes later, visibly shaken. I'd never seen my brother look so pale or heard him so scared. My aunt and uncle comforted him as best as they could, though it took a long time for him to calm down. He told us everything that happened, and for the first time, I shared my uncle's story with him. The old cabin has since fallen into ruin, and the farmer's daughter may finally be able to rest in peace. A few years ago, I lived on a farm with my family. My stepmother had always been interested in self-sufficiency, so we had chickens, ducks, and rabbits roaming the land, exploring freely. One day, 2 of our older ducks vanished without a trace. There were no feathers or signs of a struggle. They were just gone. We thought they might have wandered off, but we were worried since the area was rural, with neighbors visible only in the distance. That night, as rain began to fall, my stepmom and I did our usual check on the animals to make sure they were sheltered. While doing so, we heard a duck quacking in the woods and decided to investigate, hoping to find our missing ducks. My dad and brother followed, bringing flashlights and rifles just in case. My stepmom and I stood by the stream that ran along the back of the property, listening for any sounds. Just then, we heard a whistle coming from the trees in front of us, and we thought it was my brother signaling us. When my dad and brother emerged from the other direction, asking if we had whistled, we realized it hadn't been any of us. We all stood there, confused and on edge, as the whistling continued from the seemingly empty woods ahead of us. A similar event happened a week later, though this time I wasn't there. My brother and sister were watching the sky darken before a storm when they saw a man in white crouching in the back field. My brother fired a warning shot, and the figure vanished, but my sister swore she saw him standing behind a fence post with a strange glow around him, making him visible in the dim light. After that, our parents forbade us from venturing into the woods alone. When I was about 26, I decided to travel the world to escape the struggles I was facing back home in Washington. After graduating college, I was drowning in debt, lonely, and unable to find steady work. A friend suggested I try woofing, volunteering on organic farms around the world to cover my travel costs. You work about 25 hours a week in exchange for room and board, which is a great way to explore new places on a budget. Over 8 months, I worked on farms across the U.S. and saved enough cash to finally travel internationally. On a whim, I let a randomizer online choose my next destination, and it landed on Georgia. I didn't know much about the country, but the idea of going somewhere unfamiliar sounded perfect. After some searching, I found a remote farm in Georgia that was willing to host me. The photos showed a traditional Georgian stone house, a big garden, and a cheerful family. Arriving in Georgia was no easy feat. The transportation was rough, Soviet-era buses on crumbling roads, and after about 20 hours of travel, I finally reached the farm. But the moment I arrived, something felt off. The house was old and run down, and the land looked dead, nothing like the lush, vibrant photos I'd seen. A man named Geary, not his real name, greeted me. He was a middle-aged man with a friendly, if somewhat unsettling smile. He said his family was away at the moment, and for some reason that made me nervous. After a quick meal, I went to bed, too exhausted to care much. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange sound, something heavy, metallic, being dragged across the floor. I lay in bed listening until it finally stopped, and I managed to fall back asleep, brushing it off as an oddity of the old house. The next morning, Geary left to get some supplies, leaving me alone on the property. With no cell service or internet, I wandered the house to get a better look. The place was filled with broken furniture, old newspapers, and even shattered mirrors. Looking around, I realized that the house didn't match the photos at all. The garden was dead, and none of the smiling faces from the pictures were anywhere to be seen. A chill ran down my spine. Then, as I looked out the window, I noticed 3 men approaching the house. They didn't look friendly, and there was no other way out but the front. Panicking, I grabbed my things and slipped out a back window, climbing down a steep hill and into the woods. From my hiding spot, I watched as the men went inside, their voices carrying through the trees. I stayed hidden, terrified they would find me. Eventually they left, and I made my way back to the main road, where I managed to flag down a passing car. The driver, a kind family, took me to the nearest town. A few days later, I checked the woofing site and saw that the farm's listing had been taken down. I never heard from Geary or anyone else about that place. People sometimes laugh and say maybe Geary was harmless, but I trust my instincts. Something was very wrong there, and I was lucky to get away. At the time, I was in summer school, and we had a 3-day weekend in June. I thought it would be fun to go hiking in Virginia's woods. I looked on Google and found a state park with a nice path, so I chose to visit that park. I packed all the essentials: clothes, food, water, and a tent. Just in case something went wrong, I also told my family and roommate which path I was going to hike. When I got close to the park, I saw a small outdoor store frequented by people walking the Appalachian Trail. I went in to buy a map of the area. The owner told me about a lesser-known trail with a cool waterfall and swimming spot, saying it was a lovely spot that not many people knew about. It sounded wonderful, so I asked him to mark it on the map. Even though it wasn't part of the state park, he said it was worth the trip. I thanked him, paid for the map, and updated friends and family on my new route. Then I parked my car and began my journey. The waterfall was not part of my main hike, and I planned to stay on my trip for 3 days and 2 nights. I began my journey on a busy section of the Appalachian Trail and enjoyed chatting with other hikers. As I ventured further away from the main trails, I saw fewer and fewer people. Early in the afternoon, about 3 miles from my destination, I noticed a strange silence. No bugs, no birds, not even wind, and I had the eerie feeling of being watched. I brushed it off, thinking I was overthinking things. The waterfall itself was not as impressive as I'd hoped, but the swimming area was spacious. I took a swim and hummed to myself as I dressed. I was whistling the tune from Chill Bill, and then I heard something whistle the same tune back. I assumed it was a bird mimicking me and started a whistling exchange with it. It would repeat whatever I whistled, and I thought it was pretty neat. As I set up my camp, the feeling of being watched crept back, making my skin prickle. I made a small fire and cooked dinner, but everything remained dead silent. I felt an odd urge to leave, but instead, I crawled into my tent with a flashlight and a book. I fell asleep quickly, only to wake up the next morning to a mess. My camp stool was gone, and my bear bag's handle had been cleanly cut. At first, I thought a clever animal had chewed through the rope, but it looked like it had been cut with something sharp. Remember, I was at least 6 to 8 miles from the nearest road. While examining the mess, I heard a tree break in the distance. There was nothing around, but then I heard the whistle again. It was the same whistle from yesterday, but it sounded sinister, making my skin crawl. I packed up quickly, not bothering to organize, as the whistling came from everywhere around me. Panicked, I yelled into the woods, and after a moment of silence, it repeated what I said. Only this time, it used my own voice, twisted and unnatural. Terrified, I put on my pack and started running back. Something followed, mimicking my voice, but always just far enough behind. After a while, it stopped suddenly, and I made the mistake of turning around. A blood-curdling scream erupted near me, so loud it seemed to come from inside my head. I didn't dare look back and just kept running as fast as I could. A half-mile later, I encountered a couple who saw my terrified expression and asked if I was okay. I told them what happened, and they decided not to take the path I'd come from. We joined a busier trail and I headed straight to my car. I stopped at a ranger station to report what I'd experienced, but they told me it was outside their jurisdiction. As I got into my car, I heard the Chill Bill tune coming from the woods. When I told my roommate about the trip and why I'd come back early, he just said, "Bro, I'm never going camping with you again." I grew up on a vast farm in western Mississippi. My younger brother and I had countless adventures exploring the seemingly endless fields of corn, especially when it was tall in late summer. It felt like a green jungle, full of hidden spots and paths that only we knew. One day we decided to venture farther than usual, aiming to reach a creek on the far side of our land. We had been there a few times before, and the cool water was a refreshing treat after a long, hot walk. We were just chatting as we walked when suddenly we stepped into an unexpected clearing, about 40 or 50 feet wide. It was strange because we'd never seen a clearing like this in the middle of the cornfields. But what really made us stop was what we saw in the clearing. About 10 men, all dressed in neat clothes, button-up shirts and slacks, not farming attire, were standing around large pieces of electronic equipment that seemed oddly out of place. They all froze and turned to look at us, shock and maybe a bit of fear in their eyes, as if we'd caught them doing something they weren't supposed to. One of the men started toward us, his face tense. My brother and I didn't wait around. We bolted back through the cornfields, running as fast as we could until we reached our house. We never told our parents, worried they wouldn't believe us. To this day, we don't know who those men were or what they were doing, but my brother and I still talk about it as the strangest thing we ever saw in those fields.